I would now like to introduce our next session, The Modern Elder, What's in It for Employers, featuring Chip Conley, the founder and CEO of the Modern Elder Academy. And Chip has so graciously and generously pre-recorded a conversation with us, which he was unable to make it in person, but we tremendously appreciate that he has recorded this video of us sharing his journey and his life experiences. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Chip, he has, you'll hear his story, so I'll keep the bio short. He is the author of the best-selling book, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, and as I mentioned, the Modern Elder Academy. And if you have not read his book, I highly, highly recommend it. Speaking for myself, over the last, 7 years, it's one of the books that has most profoundly impacted how I view aging and in the workforce, but something I've also taken very personally to heart. If you're familiar with Chip, you're in for a treat. If you're not familiar with Chip, in many ways, with this video, you're in for an even bigger treat. So with that, I am nodding to the AVs in the back of the room.
My name is Chip Conley, and I wish I was going to be there in Denver with you right now. My mom grew up in Denver, and I spent a lot of time there, and Colorado is one of my favorite places on earth. So, but I'm here in Baja, holding down the fort of the Modern Elder Academy. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about age-friendly workplaces and what I've learned over the course of both my personal time in the workplace at Airbnb, but also what we've learned here at MEA over the past 4.5, almost 5 years since we opened. So let me tell you a little bit of my story first. So I was an entrepreneur who started a boutique hotel company when I was 26, called Joie de Vivre, means joy of life in French. And I knew that I was intrigued by the hospitality industry, but I wanted to do it in a pioneering new way, which is sort of a common theme in my career. And Joie de Vivre grew to 52 boutique hotels around the state of California, became the second largest boutique hotelier in the U.S. But to be quite honest, between about age 45 and 50, when I'd been running the company for almost 24 years, I realized I didn't love it anymore. And in fact, I was going through a bit of an existential crisis. I lost 5 friends to suicide during the Great Recession, all men in midlife. And I knew I didn't want to do this anymore either. And it took me, the hotelier, to have a wake-up call, to have a flatline experience, literally dying and having to be brought back to life. Excuse me. I get choked up when I talk about this because of an allergic reaction to an antibiotic that I was on. And it happened right after I was on stage in St. Louis, Missouri, giving a talk about my book, Peak. And over the course of the next couple of days, I went flatline 9 times in 90 minutes. And then I had some time to really reflect on my life and how I wanted to live it, knowing that, gosh, at any moment I could pass away. And I was only 47 years old when all this happened, but, I was solidly in midlife. And I sort of understood the term midlife crisis, like what is a midlife crisis? I now think of it as a midlife calling or even a midlife chrysalis, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. Coming out of that experience and being in a pretty dark time in my life, I decided to sell my company at the bottom of the Great Recession. It was not a good time to do so, but it was what I needed. I knew that I needed to move on. I wasn't really sure what I was going to move on to yet, though. And so Joie de Vivre, now known as JDV, is a Hyatt brand because I sold it in 2010. Now, I sold it at the bottom of the market, so let's be clear about that too. I didn't make a fortune. I made good money, but not great money. And I was, going to retire. I could retire. I could have retired at that point at age 50, but I wasn't sure what was next for me. And there's a great line from the movie The Intern with Robert De Niro and Anne Hathaway, in which De Niro says, "Musicians don't retire, they quit when there's no more music left inside of them." And I guess I knew I had music inside of me. I would never have called it, this is 12 years ago, I would never have called it wisdom. I wasn't, I guess I didn't really see that what I had was wisdom. I just knew I had some know-how and maybe some know-who. And it was around that time, actually, it was around when I turned 52, 2 years later, that I got a call from the three founders of Airbnb. Now, this is this tiny little tech startup in San Francisco. I was based in San Francisco, literally 12 blocks away from my home. I could walk to the office. And Brian Chesky, the CEO and one of the three co-founders, called me up and said, "Chip, we know a lot about you. We've seen what you've done. We know you've sold your company. We would love to have you join us as our head of global hospitality and strategy and my in-house mentor." I'm 31 years old. Average age in the company is 26. You're 52. I was like, "How do you know all these things? You've clearly done your research on me." And he said, "I'd like to Uber over to your house and spend some time talking to you." And at that time, 10 years ago, I'd never heard of Uber. So when he said he was going to Uber to my house, I was like, I had no idea what that meant. So he Ubered over. We spent 4 hours in my backyard cottage, and next thing I knew, I had signed up to be part of this rocket ship called Airbnb that was meant to go global with its hospitality product, but nobody in the company had a hospitality or travel industry background. So flash forward is the next 7.5 years I was involved with Airbnb, 4 years full time, as Brian called me, the Secretary of State for the company. And then 3.5 years as a strategic advisor. Within the first couple of months at Airbnb, what I learned was the following. I learned that I was not just the mentor, I was also the intern, just like De Niro. De Niro came in to Anne Hathaway as the intern and then became the mentor. I came in as the mentor and became the intern because at 52 years old, I'd never worked in a tech company before. I just hadn't. And so what was I going to do? How could I offer something in an industry that I didn't really understand? So it required me to be as curious as I was wise. And that's what the founders called me about 2 months into it. They said, "Chip, you're our modern elder." And I said, "I don't want to be a modern elder." "What do you mean? You're saying I'm elderly?" And they said, "No, elderly is the last part of your life. An elder is a relative term. And a modern elder is not the traditional elder. The traditional elder was someone who had wisdom and they dispensed it. But a modern elder is as curious as they are wise. And we've really appreciated that at 52 years old, you're learning a new industry, tech. So I was often offering to the younger people in the company my EQ, my understanding of emotional intelligence as applied to leadership. And I was receiving back DQ, not Dairy Queen, but digital intelligence. And that was really valuable. So over the course of my 7.5 years at Airbnb, I had over 100 mentees. But I've got to say that in probably 75% of the cases, I was learning as much from them as they were learning from me. So I call someone who's a mentor and an intern at the same time a mentern. And I think we were all better off for it. One of the things that Brian said to me a few months into the job is he said, "Chip, we hired you for your knowledge, but what we really got was your wisdom." And that was when I started to really explore the idea of what's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. It was Peter Drucker in 1959 who coined the term knowledge worker. And when he coined that term, no one had any idea what he was talking about. Because, how many people had seen a computer in 1959? Most computers were the size of a home. There are these big supercomputers that were like stored in the basement in a building. And they had lots of computer power, but they had huge spaces they needed because they had not, the industry hadn't created the miniature versions that we have today. And so knowledge workers really, Drucker said knowledge workers will, be the power force in the future workplace. And he was right. 7 of the 10 most valuable companies in the world today are tech companies, which is full of knowledge workers. But I think we've moved to an era where it's not about knowledge workers anymore. Because all of the knowledge of the world is in your phone, in your pocket. Google has it right there, available to you. But what's deeply needed is not knowledge, but wisdom. And so I think we are moving into an era where it is possible that we might retire the term knowledge worker, because almost everybody today is a knowledge worker. But what's desperately needed, since we're awash in knowledge, is the scarce resource of wisdom. So let's talk about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, and why wisdom workers are so needed in the workplace today. So knowledge is an arithmetic equation. It's about adding. You talk about accumulating knowledge. And knowledge can be the same for two different people. You're a 25-year-old learning about the capital of Paraguay, and you're a 75-year-old learning the same fact. So knowledge, that's obviously a fact, but even knowledge of what are the 4 steps to running a great meeting. Now that starts to veer a little bit beyond just knowledge, because frankly, it depends. There's a lot of variables when it comes to the meeting and what would make for a great meeting. And as we move in from the tangible to the intangible, you move from why knowledge is important to what wisdom is all about. Now, wisdom is not about accumulating, in the sense that wisdom is not just an arithmetic equation. It's almost like a division equation. It's actually distilling down all of that knowledge, all of the experience, to what's truly essential in this particular moment. I like to define wisdom as metabolized experience, which leads to distilled compassion. Metabolized experience that leads to distilled compassion. Now, I used to say it was just metabolized experience. And what I meant by that was, you get wiser the more raw material you have. And the raw material is your experience, and allows you to build a sense of pattern recognition, and maybe even a sense of intuition. You can you've seen this movie before, you know how it's going to end, so to speak, when it comes to a relationship with someone at work, potentially. But metabolized experience without the distilled compassion means that you can be wise. If you're wise without serving the world, then I don't really believe that's wisdom. And that's why I think the distilled compassion is important. And in the context of the workplace, and my experience at Airbnb in particular, what that meant was the question in my head much of the time was, how do I serve here? Now, when I was younger in my career, it was like, who can serve me? How could I get something out of this? But as Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, said, the primary operating system during the first half of our life is our ego, and during the second half of our life, it's our soul. And it's in midlife that there's an operating system change, and that yet we have done very little as a society to prepare people for the fact that that's what's going to happen around 45 or 50 years old. And what that means in the workplace is the person in their 50s or 60s in the workplace is probably a little bit less selfish, a little bit better at holistic thinking, very interested in the purpose and what they can do to serve that purpose. And I'm not talking about everybody here, but let's look at a few facts. Number one is emotional intelligence is something that tends to grow with age. IQ doesn't, EQ does. Number two, as Arthur Brooks so eloquently put it in his book, From Strength to Strength, what we have when we're young is fluid intelligence. That tends to be the ability to solve problems quickly and in a linear fashion. But as we get older, what we get better at is crystallized intelligence. Our ability to look at a problem holistically or systemically and connect the dots. And so that's something that we get better at as we get older. Thirdly, as Google has proven in their Project Aristotle, the number one ingredient for successful teams and effective teams in America and in Google globally is psychological safety. Now, this is something that it's been found is brought to a team much better if it's older. You have a mixture, a diverse collection of ages, because what the older people do on a team is they help to create a less competitive environment. When I say less competitive, I mean internally competitive. The team may be competitive toward whomever else they're competing with, but it's less people trying to climb that career ladder faster, which is what you tend to do when you're in your 20s and your 30s and maybe your 40s. And so these are some of the qualities that make for effective, diverse teams. Now, when we talk about diversity in the workplace, we are very clear that it relates to gender, to race or ethnicity, to sexual orientation, to maybe ableism and whether somebody is what their physical structure is, whether they're in a wheelchair or whatever. But there's only 8% of the world's Fortune 1000 companies that actually have expanded their definition of diversity to include age as a metric for them to consider when they're actually trying to consider whether they have created a diverse workplace. That's pathetic. What are we talking about here? 8%. I mean, we know we have in some companies today 5 generations in the workplace at the same time. How are we going to harness the energy of these different workers who bring different talents to the table? I like to think of today's workplace as like an intergenerational potluck, with each generation bringing to the table what they know or do best. And there's so much evidence now, much of it out of Europe, because Europe is an older population than the US. And some of the studies, especially out of Germany, have shown the huge value of intergenerational teams. I know that in my experience at Airbnb, I was really able to see that when I was at the table, not only did I represent a different point of view, my brain works differently than someone who's 25 years old, especially if they're an engineer and I'm much more of a generalist. But actually, I was able to represent the voice of the customer. One of the things we did at Airbnb that I'm so proud of is that 2 of our most high-profile guests in the world were Michael and Debbie Campbell. You can look them up in the New York Times. They've had 2 or maybe even 3 articles written about them. They've spent the last 9 years almost exclusively on Airbnb traveling the world. They sold their home, they sold their boat in Seattle, and they decided in their 60s and 70s, they wanted to go travel the world. And so when I said to Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, who I was reporting to, but also mentoring, which is an interesting dynamic as well, that I wanted to bring in a customer for 10 weeks as an intern to help elevate the voice of the customer in the company, I told him I wanted to bring in Debbie and Michael. Now, for a company that's full of millennials, for a company that serves the millennial market exceptionally well, Airbnb is the most valuable company in the world, most valuable hospitality company in the world today, but exceptionally successful in the millennial world. To bring in 2 baby boomers as our voice of the customer was a bit crazy, but it worked so well, partly because our designers, our engineers, our product managers at Airbnb hadn't had a lot of experience with boomers as customers, but it was our fastest growing segment, demographic age segment on the Airbnb platform. So bringing them in helped to have a voice of the customer there at the table. So the question you might ask yourself in your company is, what voice is missing at the table demographically? And it doesn't have to be just an age one, but often I think age is a hidden one that we need to consider. And so in this case, we created a whole bunch of new features for the Airbnb product because of this. Also, our fastest growing segment of hosts in the world was older hosts, and our highest rated segment of Airbnb hosts in the world were women over 60 who were hosts. They had the highest customer satisfaction ratings. So there's a lot to unpack here and a lot to consider, but let me give you a few facts that I think I'm going to finish with to just help solidify why age-friendly workplaces and workplaces that really help harness the energy of all generations is important. Number one is today 40% of Americans have a younger boss. Now I did for sure. My boss happened to be my mentee, and that is an unusual situation with Brian, but he was 21 years younger than me. So we are going to have to get more and more used to this because the Department of Labor says that by the year 2025, the majority of Americans will have a younger boss. What? Wow, that's amazing. Number two is 75% of millennials say they would like to have a mentor. What percentage actually have a mentor? 2%. That's a big gap. 75% want a mentor, 2% have a mentor. There's a real opportunity there, especially for mutual mentorship. The idea that an older person and a younger person can work well together as a mentor and a mentee, in which they're both mentors. The older person has something to teach the younger person has something to teach the older person. And then finally, and this is a stat that's just fascinating, between 2016 and 2026, the U.S. Department of Labor says that almost half of the growth in the labor force in the United States will be older workers, workers 60 or older. Now so some of you are saying, what are you talking about? That's impossible. Well, I guess the math is possible because it's been vetted multiple times now, that stat. And it has a lot to do with two things. Number one is the baby boomer generation is a huge generation. So that's number one. Number two is this is a generation that intends to stay in the workplace longer. So up until the year 2000, from 1960 to the year 2000, the age at which people retired got younger and younger. And then starting in the year 2000 and continuing to this day, people are waiting to retire longer, waiting to retire later in their career. Why is that? It's partly by choice, partly by necessity. The choice is that, there's some pretty conclusive evidence that shows that people, when they retire, increase their mortality rate by 2 years. So actually, retirement is not good for your health often. There's a lot of reasons for that. I won't go into the details there, but people know that. And even the word retirement is sort of like a taboo word now. So here at MEA, at the Modern Elder Academy, we talk about regeneration and the idea of how do we regenerate ourselves in midlife and later. And the other thing is that, if you're going to live longer, that means you have to pay for a longer life. So it's hard to finance a 30-year retirement with a 40-year career. And so for a lot of people, they're by necessity deciding to stay in the workplace longer. And they're maybe even creating a portfolio career. So to sum up, part of all of this is interesting to me on a personal level because of the fact that for me in midlife, I had a dark period, which led me to selling my company, and a light period, which is when I learned about what it meant to become a modern elder at Airbnb. And all of this led me to creating the Modern Elder Academy with our first campus here on the beach in Mexico, and with 2 campuses soon to open in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We also have MEA online programs and as well as regenerative communities, residential communities built around regenerative farms or ranches. So I just feel so honored to join you. I wish I could be there with you in person. But I am a huge advocate for the idea of intergenerational collaboration in the workplace and the opportunity that companies have strategically to have a strategic advantage relative to their competitors by focusing on age as a competitive advantage. And actually, how do you bring the generations together in the workplace to create an even better product? I'm wishing you all the best. I hope your conference is going well. Thank you so much.